Hey guys, tonight, before we go anywhere, I need you to do one thing for me. I need you to forget, just for a few hours, everything you think you know about the most beloved family in American history. Not because they were bad people, they were not. Not because the stories were lies, they were not exactly. But because the story you have been given, the warm, firelit, fiddle-playing version with Ma's spotless calico and Pa's bottomless optimism, and the little house that always had enough love in it to make up for everything it lacked in every other department. That story has a hidden first chapter. A chapter that begins not with Charles Ingalls and Caroline Quiner standing before an officiant on a cold Wisconsin morning in February of 1860, which is the wedding that history has always pointed to and said, "There, that is where it started. That is the beginning of the Little House story." It begins 14 months earlier. It begins with a different young woman in a different wedding dress, standing in a different justice court on a different cold Wisconsin morning, holding the hands of a man most of you have never heard of, watched by families who did not yet know they were about to become one. Her name was Pauline Malona Ingalls. She was 18 years old, and she was Charles Ingalls' sister, the man she was marrying. Henry Oden Quiner, age 23, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, now farming the land immediately adjacent to the Ingalls family property in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, was Caroline Quiner's brother. Think about that for one moment. Pa's sister married Ma's brother, 14 months before Pa married Ma, and then, 14 months after that, Pa's brother married Ma's sister. 3 marriages, 2 families, 28 months. All in the same small Wisconsin township, at the same small justice court, between the same 2 sets of neighbors who had grown up side by side on adjacent farms in the Wisconsin frontier and decided, in the span of less than 2.5 years, to tie themselves so thoroughly together in blood and law that there would never again be any meaningful distance between the Ingalls family and the Quiner family. Most fans of Little House on the Prairie have heard about Charles and Caroline. Almost none of them have heard the full story of what came before. And here is the part that will quietly rearrange something in your understanding of this family. The thing that most people think they know about Polly Ingalls. Pa's sister, the woman who made the first of these 3 marriages, is not just incomplete, it is wrong, flatly, demonstrably, documentable wrong. There is a myth about Polly Ingalls that has circulated in Little House circles for decades, passed from reader to reader like a piece of inherited gossip, repeated on genealogy forums and fan sites and comment sections so many times that it has acquired the texture of fact. The myth says that Polly Ingalls was only 11 years old when she married. She was 18. The difference between those 2 numbers is not a rounding error. It is not a minor historical quibble. It is a gap of 7 years, and it matters deeply because the myth of the child bride has been quietly obscuring one of the most remarkable stories in the entire Little House world. The story of what 2 ordinary frontier families did, deliberately and methodically, and with a kind of social intelligence that scholars have compared to the alliance building of medieval dynasties, when they decided to convert proximity into permanence and turn 2 neighbouring farms into one unbreakable kinship network. Tonight, we are going to tell the real story. Not the myth, not the comfortable, softened version that comes filtered through a series of semi-fictional children's books. The real story. The documented story. The story that lives in Wisconsin court records and federal census data and the meticulous work of the Pioneer Girl Project, which has spent decades peeling back the layers of literary mythology to find the human beings underneath. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Drop your city and local time in the comments, and come with me to Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1859, where a story began that Laura Ingalls Wilder almost never told. Let me place you in the world. It is not an easy world. The Wisconsin of 1859 is not the Wisconsin you might picture if you have spent too long with the warm, amber-lit imagery of Little House in the Big Woods. The cozy log cabin, the venison smoking over a fire, the sound of Pa's fiddle drifting through a door that always opens onto a manageable wilderness. That world is real in its emotional core. Laura's memories of her Wisconsin childhood, filtered as they were through 60 years in the editorial hand of her daughter Rose, captured something genuine about what it felt like to be a small child in a house that was warm and safe while the dark pressed in from outside. But the world outside that door was genuinely hard. Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the late 1850s, was what historians call a recently settled agricultural community, which is a careful academic phrase for a place that has only recently stopped being raw frontier and has not yet fully figured out what comes next. The fields had been cleared, mostly. The roads existed, mostly. There were churches and schools and a county courthouse, but the margin between stability and disaster was thin in a way that the books never quite convey, and every family in that township knew it. The Ingalls family had arrived in Concord Township in 1854, when Lansford Whiting Ingalls, Charles's father, Laura's grandfather, a man whose restless ambition and chronically unreliable financial judgment would become hereditary traits in his descendants, purchased 80 acres of Wisconsin land and decided, not for the last time, that this was the place where the family would finally set down permanent roots. The 80 acres were real. The roots were never quite permanent. But in 1854, the purchase of that land in Jefferson County placed Lansford Ingalls and his 9 children on a specific piece of ground in a specific neighborhood next to a specific set of neighbors. Those neighbors were the Quiner family, or, more precisely, the Holbrook family, because Charlotte Tucker Quiner, Ma Ingalls' mother, the woman who had been widowed in 1844 when her first husband, Henry Newcomb Quiner, died aboard the schooner Ocean in a Lake Michigan storm, leaving her with a house full of children and a frontier farm and no road map for what came next, had remarried in 1849. Her second husband was a man named Frederick Holbrook. His land in Concord Township adjoined the Ingalls property. And so, when Lansford Ingalls arrived in 1854, the children of his new neighbour's household, including a 15-year-old girl named Caroline Quiner, who taught school for $10 a month, and a 19-year-old young man named Henry Quiner, who worked the adjacent fields, were already there. They were already there. And 2 families who had grown up in entirely different parts of the country. The Ingalls line running back through New York and Vermont, the Quiner line running through Ohio and Massachusetts and Halifax, Nova Scotia, found themselves, by the ordinary accident of real estate and westward migration, living close enough to share a fence line. What followed from that proximity was not accident. It was strategy. Not cold strategy, not loveless, calculating strategy, but the deeply human, deeply practical, deeply sensible strategy of people who understood that on the frontier, the distance between surviving and not surviving often came down to one question. Who was going to help you when things went wrong? And on the frontier, things went wrong constantly. You need to understand this about the world these families lived in. The economy of frontier farming in Wisconsin in the 1850s was built on a foundation that was always one bad harvest, one financial downturn, one unexpected death away from collapsing entirely. Lansford Ingalls' farm, which seemed stable in 1854, would be auctioned off by the sheriff in January of 1861. 7 years. That is how long it took for the careful purchase of 80 Wisconsin acres to end in a public auction and a family forced to scatter. The Quiner family understood this vulnerability from direct experience. Henry Newcomb Quiner had died in November of 1845, when his youngest children were still small, leaving Charlotte a widow with resources, but no male partner in an economy that structured nearly everything around the assumption of male labour and male legal authority. She had survived. She had remarried strategically. But the memory of how quickly a family's world could change was not something the Quiner children would have forgotten. 2 families, both with reasons to understand how thin the ice was, both living within walking distance of each other, both with children of marriageable age, both Protestant, both are hard-working, both honest, as far as the historical record shows, in the quiet, unspectacular way that frontier people had to be honest with each other, because dishonesty was a luxury that communities too small and too interdependent to absorb it could not afford. Is it any wonder that they began to look at each other's children? Now let me tell you about the 3 marriages, not as a list of dates and names. You can get that from any genealogy website. But as what they actually were, a compressed, extraordinary act of community building, accomplished by ordinary people who understood, in their bones if not in their language, that the strongest thing they could build was not a house or a barn or a fence line. It was a family. The first marriage was the one that history has almost entirely forgotten. Pauline Malona Ingalls, known in family records and in Laura's books as Polly, though her given name was Pauline, was the fifth child of Lansford and Laura Colby Ingalls. She was born on the 14th of October 1840 in Cuba Township, New York, which means that by the time her family had moved through Illinois and arrived in Jefferson County, Wisconsin in 1854, she was 13 years old. She grew up next door to the Quiner family. She would have known Henry Oden Quiner for years. Since she was perhaps 13 or 14, and he was a young man of 17 or 18, farming the adjacent land with the particular seriousness of a firstborn son who understood that his family's survival depended on him. Henry Oden Quiner had been born on the 17th of December, 1835, in Cincinnati, Hamilton County, Ohio, the eldest surviving son of Henry Newcomb Quiner and Charlotte Tucker. He was 4 years older than Polly. He had grown up without a father after 1844, which gave him a quality that frontier communities tended to recognize and respect. The quality of a young man who had learned to be responsible before responsibility was fair to ask of him. By 1859, Polly was 18. Henry was 23. On the 15th of February, 1859, they stood together in the Justice Court in Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and were married. Not in a church. The Justice Court ceremony is significant. It tells you something about the frontier community they lived in, where clergy were not always available and civil marriage was a practical, respectable alternative. There was no shame in it. It was how things were done. What happened next, however, is what makes this story remarkable. 14 months later, on the 1st of February 1860, Charles Philip Ingalls, Polly's younger brother, the man the world would come to know as Pa, married Caroline Lake Quiner, Henry's younger sister, in the same county. Pa's sister had already married Ma's brother. Now Pa was marrying Ma, and the symmetry was not finished yet. On the 5th of June, 1861, in Concord, Wisconsin, Peter Riley Ingalls, Charles's older brother, the eldest Ingalls' son, married Eliza Ann Quiner, the youngest of the Quiner girls, who had been born on the 21st of April 1842 and who would outlive everyone in this story, dying on the 6th of June 1931, in Eagle Rock, California, 90 years old, the last living witness to a frontier world that had long since dissolved into history. 3 marriages, 2 families, 28 months, from February 1859 to June 1861, the Ingalls and Quiner families sent 3 pairs of their children to the same courthouse and made the same vows and became, in every legal and biological sense that the 19th century recognized, one family. This is what historians who study frontier communities call bilateral sibling exchange, a pattern in which siblings from one family marry siblings from another family, creating what anthropologists describe as dense bilateral kin ties. It is a pattern that has been documented across human societies for thousands of years, from the alliance marriages of European royal dynasties to the kinship networks of frontier American communities, and it serves the same purpose in every context. It converts proximity into permanence, turns neighbourhood into obligation, and creates a web of mutual support that is far stronger than any individual family unit could be on its own. What the Ingalls and Quiner families did between 1859 and 1861 was not unusual in the broad sweep of human history. What is unusual is how thoroughly it has been overlooked. Now, before we go any further into this story, and there is so much further to go, because the 3 marriages are only the beginning, and the lives that these 6 people lived after those courthouse ceremonies were full of the kind of heartbreak and resilience and quiet courage that the books never had room for. I need to address the myth, because you may have encountered it, and if you have, it has probably left a particular, uncomfortable impression about the Ingalls family and the world they lived in. The myth, as it circulates on genealogy forums and fan sites and comment sections, goes roughly like this. Polly Ingalls was just a child when she married. Some versions say she was 11. Some say 12. Some go as low as 9. The myth usually arrives wrapped in a layer of either outrage or sad resignation, depending on the disposition of the person telling it, and it has been repeated so many times in so many corners of the Little House community that it has acquired, as these things do when they travel long enough, the false solidity of documented fact. It is not documented fact. It has never been documented fact. Polly Ingalls was born on the 14th of October, 1840. She married Henry Odin Quiner on the 15th of February, 1859. The arithmetic is not complicated. She was 18 years and 4 months old on her wedding day. 18. Not 11. Not 12. Not 9. 18. A young woman who had spent 5 years growing up on a Wisconsin frontier farm next door to the man she was marrying, who had known his family as well as she knew her own, and who was making a choice that, given everything we know about the social and economic logic of frontier marriage in the 1850s, was entirely rational as well as, by every account, genuinely affectionate. Where did the myth come from? Partly from misreadings of Little House in the Big Woods, where Laura's references to Aunt Polly and the descriptions of her in the text can feel to a modern reader like descriptions of someone young and small and somehow not quite adult. But Laura's descriptions of Polly are impressionistic memories from a very small child looking up at an adult relative, the kind of memories that often make adults seem both larger and somehow more childlike than they were, because small children experience adults through a lens that distorts in that particular direction. Partly the myth came from the general assumption, which has been wrong for as long as it has existed, that frontier women married very young. In fact, the historical record shows that the average age of first marriage for American women between 1800 and 1880 was approximately 22 to 23 years old. Polly's marriage at 18 was younger than average, but by no means extraordinary, and it was absolutely not the child marriage that the myth describes. And partly, the myth persists because once a story gets into the bloodstream of a devoted fan community, it is very difficult to remove. People have emotional investments in their understanding of the families they love, and corrections that challenge those understandings often feel like attacks rather than clarifications. But the correction matters, because the myth of the child bride has been quietly drowning out the real story. The story of an 18-year-old young woman named Pauline Malona Ingalls, who made a deliberate, thoughtful choice to marry the young man from the neighbouring farm, and who began, with that choice, a chain of alliances that would bind 2 frontier families together across 3 states and 4 decades. That story deserves to be told accurately, and tonight we are going to tell it. There is one more thing I want you to hold on to as we go deeper into this. Think about what it meant, in concrete practical terms, that these 3 marriages happened. When Peter Ingalls married Eliza Quiner in June of 1861, the social structure that resulted was not just a matter of family sentiment, it was infrastructure. It was the 1850s frontier equivalent of a mutual insurance policy, a shared labour network, a system of reciprocal obligation that meant that when one household was in trouble, and trouble was not a question of if on the frontier, only of when, there were other households bound by blood and law to respond. Lansford Ingalls lost his farm in January of 1861, just months before Peter's wedding. The sheriff's auction of 80 Wisconsin acres was the kind of event that could have scattered a family to the wind, each sibling going a separate direction, the connections that proximity had built dissolving without the land to anchor them. But the connections didn't dissolve. They had been formalized in a courthouse. They were written into marriage records that no sheriff's auction could touch. And in September of 1863, when Charles Ingalls and Henry Quiner, brothers-in-law twice over by that point, Pa and Ma's brother, bound together by both of the first 2 marriages, travelled together to Pepin County, Wisconsin, and jointly purchased a piece of land. The investment they were making was not just in soil and timber. It was in each other. It was in the network they had built between them, the web of mutual obligation that 3 courthouse ceremonies had formalized, the thing that would allow the Ingalls family to keep moving west, keep failing and recovering and moving again, because there was always another household in the network to fall back on, always someone who was bound by more than mere affection to help when the next disaster struck. And disasters, as you know if you have spent any time with this family, were never far away. But before the disasters, there was the beginning. Before the Prairie and the blizzard and the claim jumping and the failed harvests, there was a Wisconsin township in the winter of 1859, and two young people standing in a justice court, and the quiet, unremarkable moment when a marriage was performed and recorded and life moved on. Polly Ingalls, Henry Quiner. The 15th of February, 1859. The first knot in a family web that would hold, through everything that came after, for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. In the next chapter, we are going to follow these families back to where they came from, back to the migrations that brought them both to that specific piece of Wisconsin ground, back to the early lives of Henry and Caroline Quiner, and the father they lost when they were small, and the mother who held the family together in the years that followed, with a tenacity that does not appear in any of the books but that is woven into every record of this family that has survived. There is a reason these two families found each other. Stay with me, because we are only at the beginning. There is a woman in this story who most people have never heard of. She doesn't appear in the Little House books, not really. She doesn't have a monument. She doesn't have a chapter. She doesn't even have a grave that most people visit. But without her, there is no chapter 1. There is no chapter 2. There are no Charles and Caroline. There is no Little House on the Prairie, no Laura on the banks of Plum Creek, no fiddle playing into the dark Wisconsin winter. Her name was Charlotte Tucker Quiner, and in November of 1844, her world collapsed in a way that would accidentally reshape the history of two American families forever. Charlotte was born on May 25th, 1809 in Roxbury, Massachusetts, the daughter of Puritan New England stocks, the kind of upbringing where you learnt early that life does not apologize, and that grief is simply weather you must walk through. She married Henry Newcomb Quiner on April 2nd, 1831 in New Haven, Connecticut. He was a trader, ambitious, restless, the kind of man who felt most alive when he was moving by land or by water, through forests, across the Great Lakes, along the routes that connected the Old East to the raw, unfinished West. They had 6 children in 12 years. Henry Odin, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1835. Caroline Lake, born in Brookfield, Wisconsin, in 1839. Eliza Ann, born in 1842. Thomas Lewis, born in 1844. By the time their youngest was an infant, Charlotte had already moved her family from Connecticut to Ohio to Wisconsin, following the same westward pull that was tugging every ambitious American family toward the frontier. And then Henry Newcomb Quiner died. November 1845. The precise cause is not confirmed across all sources. Some suggest the waters of Lake Michigan, which were not kind in autumn, were involved. What we know with certainty is that he was gone, and Charlotte was 35 years old, alone, in frontier Wisconsin, with children ranging from a 10-year-old boy to a newborn. Close your eyes for a moment and really sit with that. 35 years old, no husband, no safety net, no government support that would recognize her, no phone to call for help. Just the frozen breath of a Wisconsin November, a house that still smelled faintly of a man who was no longer in it, and 5 children looking at her waiting to find out whether the world was still going to be okay. Charlotte Tucker Quiner chose to make it okay. She did not crumble. She did not disappear. She packed up, made decisions, and moved. Within 4 years of Henry's death, she had purchased 40 acres south of the Oconomowoc River in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, 40 acres of her own, bought in her own name, during an era when that alone was an act of iron will. She was building something. Not quite sure yet what, but she was building. In June of 1849, a man named Frederick M. Holbrook purchased 13 acres just south of Charlotte's land, and on June 2nd of that same year, Charlotte Quiner married Frederick Holbrook. Here is the detail that changes everything. The Holbrook land was located just southwest of where, 5 years later, a man named Lansford Whiting Ingalls would purchase 80 acres in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. Charlotte's act of survival, buying that land, remarrying that man, building that household in that exact location, placed the Quiner children directly beside the plot of earth where the Ingalls children were going to grow up. She didn't plan it that way. No one plans for their grief to accidentally create the conditions for 3 marriages across 2 decades. But that is what happened. The widow's gambling created the geography of everything. By the time Henry Odin Quiner was 19 and Polly Ingalls was 13, their farms were so close that they could hear each other's axes on still mornings. So close that the smell of each other's cook fires drifted across the fence lines on cold evenings. So close that the word neighbour barely covered it. They were more like 2 halves of the same small world, separated only by a field and a few hundred yards of Wisconsin clay. You want to understand why 3 marriages happened in 28 months? You start here. You start with Charlotte Tucker Quiner standing in a Wisconsin winter in 1844 with 5 children and choosing to live anyway. And here is the thing about Charlotte that the history books gloss over almost completely. She was raising the 3 future spouses, Henry, Caroline, and Eliza. All 3 of them. The man who would marry Polly Ingalls. The woman who would become the beloved Ma of American childhood mythology. The younger sister who would outlive all of them by decades. Charlotte raised them in a household defined by loss and resilience, by the understanding that life on the frontier was not a guarantee, and that the only insurance you had was the people standing next to you. You wonder where Caroline got her famous steadiness, that deep, unshakable calm that Laura would spend a lifetime trying to describe in her books. The woman who crossed flooded rivers without complaint, who stretched one side of salt pork through a Dakota blizzard winter, who watched her daughter go blind and did not fall apart in front of the children. You wonder where she learned to hold it together like that. She learned it from Charlotte Tucker Quiner, who buried a husband at 35, bought land alone, remarried strategically, and built a household on the edge of the American frontier out of pure, quiet determination. That is the woman who started all of this, and she has been almost entirely forgotten. But there is someone else in this story who made the second half of the equation possible. A man with a wanderer's heart and 80 acres of Jefferson County clay, and his decisions are about to change every life. We've been following. Lansford Whiting Ingalls was born in Dunham, Lower Canada, what we now call Quebec, somewhere around 1812, the descendant of an English colonial line that traced back to a man named Henry Ingalls, who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1600s and planted himself in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Ingalls family had been moving ever since. By the time Lansford was a grown man with a wife and children, the family was living in Cuba Township, in Allegheny County, New York, in the hills of western New York State, where the winters bit deep and the farmland was productive but never quite enough. Lansford married Laura Louise Colby, a Vermont woman, and they began building the family that would eventually produce 12 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. In order, Peter Riley, born October 28, 1833, an infant who died shortly after birth in 1835, William, born 1835, Charles Philip, born January 10th, 1836, Lydia Louisa, born 1838, Pauline Polly Malona, born October 14th, 1840, James, born 1843, Dosha, born 1845, Hiram, born 1848, George, born 1851, Ruby, born 1855. That is a lot of mouths in a New York farmhouse. And Lansford had what historians might politely call a restless nature, and what Caroline Quiner Ingalls, his future daughter-in-law, might have called something less polite, based on the fact that her husband Charles inherited the same quality. The family moved first to Campton Township, Kane County, Illinois, the flat, wind-scoured tallgrass prairie just west of Elgin, where the land was cheap and the sky seemed to go on forever, in a way that was either inspiring or terrifying depending on the day. They worked that Illinois soil for several years, and then Lansford moved them again, this time to Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. In 1854, Lansford Ingalls purchased 80 acres in Concord Township. He was 42 years old. He had 9 living children ranging from age 21 down to toddlers. He had a wife who had been packing and unpacking households across 2 countries and 2 states without, as far as the historical record shows, a single recorded complaint. And he planted his family on 80 acres of Wisconsin frontier soil, next to a woman named Charlotte Holbrook and her children, who had been living there since 1848. Charles Ingalls was 18 years old when the family settled in Concord. Polly was 13. Peter was 20. Henry Quiner, Charlotte's son, was 19. Caroline was 14. Eliza was 11. For the first time, all 6 of the future intermarried spouses were living as neighbours. Now, you might be thinking, okay, they're neighbours. Neighbours don't automatically marry each other 3 times in 28 months. What were the daily mechanics of this proximity? What actually put these particular young people in a room together often enough and long enough for courtship to happen? The answer is so ordinary it almost disappoints, but it is also the truest thing about how human communities actually function. Church, school, harvest work, apple-paring bees, husking bees, quilting bees. The long, deep Wisconsin winter visits where neighbouring families gathered around someone's fire because the alternative was staring at the same 4 log walls alone until spring. The passing of meals between households when someone was sick, the borrowing of tools, the lending of labour. This was the social internet of 1854. The algorithm that decided which people spent time in each other's presence was geography, and geography had placed the Ingalls and Quiner children about as close as 2 frontier families could be without sharing a bedroom wall. By the autumn of 1858, 4 years after that first shared soil, Caroline Quiner had signed a 3-month school teaching contract for Concord Township, earning $10 a month. She was 18 years old, teaching the same children she had grown up with, a competent, literate, quietly formidable young woman who had watched her mother survive widowhood and build something from nothing. Charles Ingalls was 22. He had known Caroline since she was 14. By this point he had known her for 4 years of daily proximity harvests, church pews, community gatherings, the casual crossing of paths that happened 10 times a week when your farms were adjacent. The courtship was almost certainly already underway. But here is the thing about the sequence that most people miss entirely. While Charles and Caroline were doing whatever careful, Protestant, 1858, Wisconsin version of dating was acceptable, something else was happening simultaneously on the other side of the family. Henry Odin Quiner was 22 turning 23. He had known Polly Ingalls since she was 13. She was 17 turning 18. He was the son of the neighbouring family that the Ingalls had lived beside for 4 years. He was known. He was trusted. He had watched this young woman grow up from across a fence line. The social machinery was running for both couples at the same time, and it was Henry and Polly who got to the altar first. There is something worth sitting with in that order. The most famous couple in this story, Charles and Caroline, Pa and Ma, the couple who became the mythology of American frontier life. They were second, the one who went first, who broke the seal, who walked into that Concord Justice Court on February 15th, 1859, and bound the 2 families together for the first time, that was Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls. A man born in Cincinnati, a woman born in upstate New York, 2 people who have been almost entirely forgotten by history. And yet everything that followed the famous marriage, the third marriage, the joint land purchase, the children, the books, the mythology, everything flows from that first wedding. The question is, what was Lansford Ingalls doing while all of this was unfolding? Because his role in this story is not finished. In fact, his most consequential act is still coming. And it has nothing to do with a wedding. It has to do with debt, and an auction, and January of 1861, when the Ingalls family's world cracked open at the foundation. January 1861. Wisconsin winter is doing what Wisconsin winters do, pressing down on everything with the full weight of a sky that has forgotten the colour blue. The fields are frozen solid. The Oconomowoc River is locked under ice thick enough to walk across. The smoke from the farmhouse chimneys rises straight up in the dead, still air. And somewhere in Jefferson County, The Lansford Ingalls farmed the 80 acres that Lansford purchased in 1854, the land that created the geographic conditions for all three intermarriages. The soil that Charles and Polly and Peter had grown up on that farm is being sold at a sheriff's auction. This is the moment the history books skip past quickly. A line in a property record, a transaction in the Jefferson County Register, but the weight of it is completely different entirely. Lansford Ingalls had lived the life of a frontier farmer, ambitious, hard-working, constantly one bad harvest or one creditor away from financial catastrophe. The Preemption Act and the cycles of frontier agriculture were brutal to small landowners, especially men like Lansford, who had moved families across multiple states and carried the overhead of a very large household. By 1860, the debt had become too heavy. By January 1861, the farm was gone. Think about what that means for the people in this story. Charles Ingalls is 24 years old. He married Caroline Quiner 11 months ago, in February 1st, 1860. He is a brand new husband, full of the specific optimism of a young man who has just made a life-altering commitment. And now the family farm, the land his father planted them on, the soil he grew up working, the earth that placed his family next to the Queeners in the first place, that land belongs to someone else. Peter Ingalls is 27. He is almost certainly already courting Eliza Quiner. They will marry in June of this same year. He watches his father's farm disappear precisely as he is trying to establish his own household. The Quiner children watch this from next door. Henry and Polly are already married. Caroline is married to Charles. Eliza is being courted by Peter. The two families are already bound by 2 marriages. And now the patriarch of one of those families has lost his land. This is not merely a sad footnote. This is the economic engine that drives the next decade of decisions. The sheriff's auction of January 1861 is the moment that makes every subsequent migration make sense. When people ask why Charles and Caroline Ingalls were always moving Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota, the standard answer involves Charles's restless nature and the pull of cheap frontier land. And those are real, but the economic subtext is also real. Charles Ingalls grew up in a family that lost its land. He knew firsthand what happened when you stayed too long on soil that was rising in price and falling in productivity. He had watched his father be auctioned out of 40 years of westward movement. That knowledge lived in him. It also explains the joint Pepin County land purchase of September 1863 with absolute clarity. 13 months after the third marriage completed the family web, after Henry and Polly, Charles and Caroline, Peter and Eliza Charles Ingalls and his brother-in-law Henry Quiner bought land together in Pepin County, Wisconsin. Not individually, not on separate patches of ground a county apart, together. Adjacent portions of the same quarter section. Charles and Caroline on the south half, Henry and Polly on the north. You understand what that is, right? That is 2 men who had watched one family patriarch lose everything, deciding that they were not going to be alone in the frontier economy. That is the kinship network activating its most practical function. That is the 3 intermarriages doing exactly what bilateral sibling exchange has done in human communities since before recorded history. Turning proximity into insurance, turning family into a hedge against the kind of January morning when the sheriff rides up to your farm. The anthropologists have a term for this. They call it social capital. The historians call it frontier kinship strategy. The people living in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in 1861, probably called it something much simpler. Survival. But there is a last detail about this chapter of the story about these 2 families in this small Wisconsin township in these 28 extraordinary months that deserves to be said plainly before we move forward. When Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner stood before witnesses in Concord on June 5th, 1861, and completed the third and final interfamily marriage, something extraordinary was now true. Look at what existed that had not existed 28 months earlier. Polly Ingalls was now Polly Quiner. Her children would call Henry Quiner Pa and Charles Ingalls uncle. Caroline Quiner was now Caroline Ingalls. Her children would call Henry Quiner Uncle Henry. Peter Ingalls had married Eliza Quiner. Their children would be double cousins to both the Quiner and Ingalls lines. 3 pairs of siblings had exchanged spouses across 2 families. The result was a kinship structure so dense, so multiply reinforced, that the two families were no longer two families at all. They were one extended kinship unit, a web of mutual obligation and mutual support that would carry them across 3 states, 4 decades, and the full brutal sweep of American frontier life. And somewhere in the middle of this web, not yet born, not yet even imagined, a girl named Laura was coming. She would grow up inside this knot of family. She would hear the fiddle. She would smell the maple sugar. She would call the man who started all of this Henry Odin Quiner, the 23-year-old who walked into a Wisconsin justice court in February 1859 and married Polly Ingalls. She would call him Uncle Henry, but Laura would never fully tell his story. The question now is whether the web they built was strong enough for what was coming next, because on the farthest edge of that Dakota frontier, Henry and Polly were about to find out exactly how much weight a kinship network could hold before it broke. That story begins in the big woods that Laura made famous and ends somewhere that the books never showed you. There are 2 people standing at the back of the room who most people have never noticed. They are not the bride, they are not the groom, they are the witnesses, the 2 people whose names were written down in the Concord, Wisconsin Civil Register in February 1st, 1860, as the legal proof that Charles Philip Ingalls and Caroline Lake Quiner were married in the presence of others. Their names were Peter Ingalls and Martha Quiner. Sit with that for a second. Peter Ingalls, Charles's older brother, had watched his own sister Polly marry Henry Quiner 11.5 months earlier, in that same Justice Court building, in that same Wisconsin winter cold. He stood beside her. He had walked back across the frozen fields knowing that something had shifted, that the fence line between the Ingalls land and the Quiner land had become something more than a boundary of soil and split rail. And now, less than a year later, he was standing at the back of a room watching his brother do the same thing. Sign his name, witness the moment, become the bridge between 2 families for the 2nd time. Martha Quiner stood across from him. She was Caroline's sister, older than Caroline, the one who had watched her mother Charlotte survive widowhood and rebuild a household from grief. She had watched her brother Henry take a Wisconsin girl as his wife. She had watched this young farmer named Charles Ingalls become, by law, her brother-in-law. And now here was Caroline, her younger sister, writing her name into a marriage register beside a man Martha had known for 6 years as the boy from the farm next door. The choice of those 2 witnesses was not accidental. On a frontier where legal proceedings were spare and practical, the selection of a wedding witness was an act of deliberate social statement. You brought someone who represented your family's blessing. You brought someone who would carry the memory of the moment into the community. Peter Ingalls, as the oldest surviving Ingalls son, stood in for a father who was by January of that same year a man who had just lost his land at auction and whose authority as family patriarch had been materially diminished. Peter was the continuity. Peter was the family saying, "We are still standing." And Martha Quiner was the same on her side. Here is the extraordinary detail that gets lost in the romantic retelling of Pa and Ma's famous love story. By the time Charles Ingalls and Caroline Quiner stood before the Justice of the Peace in February 1st, 1860, they were not simply neighbours crossing the threshold into marriage. They were already related, by law. Through the 11.5-month-old union of Polly and Henry, Charles was already Henry Quiner's brother-in-law, and Caroline was already Polly Ingalls' sister-in-law. The 2 people getting married had been in-laws longer than they had been officially engaged. The 2nd marriage was not the beginning of the Ingalls-Quiner bond. It was the 2nd link in a chain that was still being built. Think about what that means for the question of love and strategy on the Wisconsin frontier. Popular memory has always given Charles and Caroline a clean love story. 2 young people on neighbouring farms, a courtship across harvest seasons and church pews, a simple wedding, and the beginning of a life. The Little House book's warmth encourages this reading, and the affection between them was real. There is nothing in the documentary record that suggests otherwise. But the context in which that love was formalized was not romantic isolation. It was community strategy in action. Charles's sister was already Caroline's sister-in-law. Caroline's brother was already Charles's brother-in-law. The families were already one legal unit at one point of connection. The 2nd marriage did not begin a bond. It reinforced one that already existed, added a 2nd legal thread to the weave, and made the kinship web one layer stronger against everything the frontier was about to throw at them. And standing at the back of the room, Peter Ingalls knew that. Because Peter was already courting Eliza Quiner, 16 months from the moment he signed his name as a witness to his brother's wedding, Peter Riley Ingalls would stand in front of his own witnesses and marry the youngest of the 3 intermarried Quiners. He was not merely a spectator at Charles's wedding, he was a man in the middle of his own courtship, watching the family web extend itself and knowing that his own moment was still coming. 3 marriages in 28 months. But here is the thing that historians have noted about the sequence that does not appear in any of the popular accounts. The first marriage made the second possible, and the second made the third almost inevitable. Not just socially legally. Under Wisconsin law and social convention in 1860, when one set of siblings had already married across family lines, the second and third pairings were viewed by the community as a continuation of an established bond, not as something unusual or exceptional. The community had already accepted the premises. Henry and Polly proved the 2 families were compatible, trustworthy, and willing to commit. Charles and Caroline formalized what Henry and Polly had initiated. And Peter and Eliza were closing a circle that had been opening since the first February morning in 1859, when Henry Quiner took Polly Ingalls by the hand in a Wisconsin justice court. The witness list told the whole story. Peter was already the next link, and the woman he was going to marry had been watching all of it from the moment her big sister Caroline said yes to the man from the farm next door with the steady gaze of a 19-year-old who already knew that her turn was coming soon. Her name was Eliza Ann Quiner, and her story is the one that no one finishes telling. June 5th, 1861. The Wisconsin summer is finally warm enough to mean it. The fields outside Concord Township are green in the way that only happens after a Wisconsin spring, that particular, almost aggressive green that makes you understand why people moved here in the first place, why they broke their backs, clearing forests and pulling stumps and building farmhouses in a climate that wanted to kill them for 6 months of every year. In June, Wisconsin apologizes for all of it. On this particular June 5th, in this particular Wisconsin summer, Peter Riley Ingalls married Eliza Ann Quiner. He was 27 years old. She was 19. They had been neighbours for 7 years. If you are keeping count, and at this point, this is the 3rd Ingalls sibling and the 3rd Quiner sibling to cross the same threshold, sign the same kind of register, stand before the same kind of civil official in the same Wisconsin township. Polly and Henry in February 1859. Charles and Caroline in February 1860. And now, in June 1861, the circle closed. The knot tied itself one final time. But there is something about the circumstances of Peter and Eliza's wedding that gets almost no attention at all, and it changes the emotional weight of this 3rd marriage completely. 4 months before Peter and Eliza stood in front of their witnesses in June, Lansford Ingalls' farm had been sold at sheriff's auction. The land was gone. The 80 acres that had brought the Ingalls family next door to the Quiners in the first place. The soil that had created the geographic conditions for all 3 of these marriages, that land now belonged to someone else. Lansford Ingalls was not the same man he had been when he arrived in Concord Township 7 years earlier, with 9 children and 80 acres, and the particular confidence of a man who believed the frontier owed him a living. He was a 60-year-old man who had lost his farm. Peter Ingalls was the oldest surviving son of that man. He had watched his father's authority and property dissolve. He had watched his younger brother Charles marry Caroline Quiner and begin building something new. He had watched his sister Polly establish a household with Henry Quiner and begin having children. And now, in the same June that saw the American Civil War moving from distant abstraction to immediate catastrophe, Peter Riley Ingalls was doing the only rational thing available to a man in his position. He was building a family. He was tying himself by law to the household next door. Eliza Ann Quiner was 19, born April 21st, 1842, the 4th surviving child of Henry Newcomb and Charlotte Tucker Quiner. She had grown up the same way her sister Caroline had without a father, in a reconstituted household, in a frontier township where survival required communal solidarity. She had watched her brother Henry marry into the Ingalls family. She had watched her sister Caroline do the same. She had been 11 years old when the Ingalls family first moved next door, and she had spent the next 7 years of her life coming of age in the same social world as Peter, Charles, Polly, and the rest of them. She was 19 when she married, younger than her sisters at their weddings, but she was not marrying a stranger or entering an unknown world. She was marrying the oldest son of the family that had been her neighbours since before she was a teenager, a man whose character she had observed across 7 years of harvests and church socials and the quiet daily proximity of frontier farm life, and she would outlive every single one of them. Eliza Ann Quiner Ingalls died on June 6, 1931, in Eagle Rock, California. She was 89 years old. She had outlived her husband Peter, who died December 14, 1900. She had outlived her sister Caroline, who died in 1924. She had outlived her sister Polly by 43 years. She had outlived her brother Henry by 45 years. The woman who married last, at 19, in a Wisconsin summer that smelled of wet grass and fresh-cut timber, was the last person alive who could remember standing in a room when any of those marriages happened. She carried the whole story in her memory, the 3 weddings, the 2 families, the kinship web across 7 decades and half the width of the American continent, from Wisconsin to Minnesota to North Dakota to California, and almost no one asked her about it while she was still alive to answer. Here is what the documentary record gives us about Peter and Eliza's life together. 6 children, per the 1890 census. A trajectory that moved westward in the slow, deliberate way that characterized the less famous of the 3 couples. Not Charles's dramatic leaping across prairie states, not Henry and Polly's plunge into the hardest Dakota frontier, but a steady westward movement that eventually deposited them on the California coast, where Eliza lived long enough to see automobiles and airplanes and the publication of Laura Ingalls Wilder's first book. She may have read Little House in the Big Woods. She may have recognized things in it. She may have noticed what was missing. Because here is what Laura's first book, the book that turned the Ingalls family into American mythology, did not tell you. By the time the events of that book unfold, the Ingalls family living in those big woods was not an isolated nuclear unit. They were the centre of a kinship web that included Henry and Polly Quiner, living just north of them on the same Pepin County land purchase that Charles and Henry had made together in September of 1863. They were neighbours again. The big woods of Laura's childhood was not the wilderness she made them. They were a community. A small, interlocking, multiply-related community of people bound by 3 marriages, 2 farms, and the collective determination to survive whatever the frontier threw at them next. And what it threw next was coming faster than anyone in that Wisconsin summer of 1861 could have imagined. The Civil War was already burning. The western land was waiting. And one of the 3 couples, the first ones, the ones who started all of this, was already walking toward a Dakota future that none of the books would follow them into. That story begins with a choice. And the choice was made the moment the 3rd wedding was over, and the knot was finally, completely, irreversibly tied. There is a version of this story that ends here: 3 weddings, 2 families, 1 kinship web, happily ever after in the Wisconsin woods. That version is comfortable. That version matches the warm amber glow of the Little House books, the fiddle by the fire, the maple sugar on snow, the long winter evenings when the family was safe and together, and the outside world could not get in. But that version leaves out the part that makes this story actually true. In September of 1863, 2 years after Peter and Eliza's wedding completed the 3 marriage sequence, and 4 years before Laura Ingalls Wilder was born, Charles Ingalls and Henry Quiner executed a joint land purchase in Pepin County, Wisconsin. Charles and Caroline settled on the south portion. Henry and Polly settled in the north. On paper, this is a property transaction. In human terms, it is the kinship network doing exactly what it was built to do. Think about what the world looked like in September 1863. The Civil War was in its 3rd year. The Homestead Act had been signed into law the previous year, throwing open the possibility of free western land to any American head of household willing to claim it and work it. The frontier had moved further west, and everyone with energy and ambition and not quite enough capital to stay comfortable in Wisconsin was feeling the pull. Lansford Ingalls had already lost his Jefferson County farm. The economic message was written plainly in the soil. The frontier rewards early movers and punishes those who arrive when the land is already expensive. Charles Ingalls and Henry Quiner bought Pepin County land together because they were not willing to be alone in that economy. Two men who were, through the marriages, simultaneously brothers-in-law in both directions. Henry was Charles's sister's husband, and the brother of Charles's wife invested in adjacent parcels of the same Wisconsin quarter section. They would work on that land cooperatively. They would share the costs and the labor. They would build the kind of community that Charlotte Tucker Quiner had built in Jefferson County after she buried her first husband. Practical, resilient, multiply reinforced against the particular cruelties of frontier economic life. And it was in this community, this joint Pepin County settlement, this Big Woods Township, that Laura Ingalls Wilder was born on February 7th, 1867. She was born into the kinship web. She did not enter it later. She was born inside it. Henry and Polly Quiner were her nearest neighbours. Their children were her playmates. The sounds she heard through the log walls of her childhood, the voices, the visiting. The community gatherings were the sounds of the three intermarriages functioning exactly as they were designed to function. And yet when Laura sat down at 1930 to write the book that would become Little House in the Big Woods, the triple marriage at the foundation of that community was almost entirely invisible. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about what happens when literary memory replaces historical memory. Laura was writing childhood memoirs filtered through 6 decades of time and the shaping requirements of narrative. She could not include everything. She chose what served the story she was telling. And the story she was telling was the story of a child's experience of frontier life, not anthropological survey of frontier kinship networks. But absence has consequences, because the gap between what Laura wrote and what actually happened has allowed a myth to grow in the space where the true story should be the myth of Polly Ingalls, the child bride. The myth of Charles and Caroline's marriage as the original bond between the two families. The myth of the Ingalls household as a self-sufficient unit, rather than one node in a carefully constructed web of mutual survival. Here is what the records actually show. The Pepin County Census of 1870 lists the Ingalls household and the Quiner household in proximity. The children of both households are growing up together double cousins, as the genealogists classify them, because their parents are siblings who married siblings. Mary Ingalls and the Quiner children are, by blood, closer to each other than ordinary first cousins. Laura and the Quiner children are the same. They share both sets of grandparents. They share both family lines. This is the world that Laura Ingalls Wilder produced. Not the lone prairie mythology of the famous television series, not the isolated nuclear family of popular imagination, but a dense, multiply-connected community of people who had chosen each other through 3 deliberate marriages in 28 months as their best available insurance against everything the American frontier intended to do to them. The big woods that Laura wrote about were real. The community inside them was real. The kinship web at the center of it was real, and documented, and more remarkable than anything the books gave you credit for. But here is where the story turns. Because the joint Pepin County settlement was not permanent, and the 3 couples who had built it, who had arrived in those Wisconsin woods as one interlocked family unit, and built something genuinely extraordinary in the space between their farm fences, were about to begin the process of going in different directions. Charles's wandering foot was already tapping. Henry and Polly were looking further west. And the kinship web that had protected all of them through the Civil War years and the frontier economy and the loss of Lansford Ingalls' farm was about to face its hardest test. The question was simple and brutal, and the answer took 25 years to arrive. How much could a web of marriages hold, and what happened to the people inside it when the frontier finally turned against them? The woman who would answer that question with her own body was Polly Ingalls Quiner. She married first, she paid the highest price. And her story, the part the books didn't follow, is waiting just ahead. We left Polly Ingalls Quiner with a promise. We told you she was the one who paid the highest price. We told you to hold that thought. It is time to make good on that. Right now, in the autumn of 1863, the kinship web is alive. It works exactly as it was designed to work. The Pepin County land, 160 acres of Wisconsin hardwood country, has been divided. Charles and Caroline are in the south portion. Henry and Polly are in the north. The same ground. The same ridge. Smoke from both chimneys rising at the same time on cold mornings. Two households are so close that the children of one family are practically the daily companions of the other. Think about what that means in real terms. It means when harvest comes, you do not work alone. It means when a child spikes a fever in the night, there is another woman 30 yards away who knows what to do. It means when the price of wheat drops and the winter is longer than expected, two families sharing a land investment are harder to break than one family standing alone. This is what frontier kinship was actually for. Not sentiment. Survival. And for a brief window, roughly 1863 to 1867, the years Laura Ingalls Wilder would later call the earliest and warmest memories of her childhood, it works. Mary Ingalls is born the 10th of January, 1865. Laura herself arrives the 7th of February, 1867. Henry and Polly's children, older cousins, neighbours, playmates are right there on the adjacent land. Laura is born not just into a family. She is born into a network. What she will not understand for decades, what the books she writes will never fully say, is that this network is already beginning to crack. It is not an insult. It is a documented pattern. The man who charmed Caroline Quiner into marrying him in 1860 was the same man who, within 9 years of that wedding, would load his family into a covered wagon and head for Kansas, leaving behind the Pepin County land, leaving behind Henry and Polly, and beginning the series of moves that his daughter would eventually turn into the most famous frontier childhood in American literary history. Here is the documented sequence, straight from the Pioneer Girl Project and the Census record. In 1869, Charles Ingalls moved his family Caroline, Mary, Laura, and infant Carrie out of Pepin County, Wisconsin, and southwest to the Osage Diminished Reserve in Montgomery County, Kansas, settling near the town of Independence. That is approximately 700 miles from Pepin County. 700 miles in an era of wagon travel is not a day trip. It is a severance. The Kansas chapter ends in the spring of 1871. Charles brought the family back to Wisconsin briefly, and then the restlessness took hold again. By 1874, they were in Plum Creek, Minnesota, near Walnut Grove. By 1876 and 1877, Burr Oak, Iowa. By 1879, they were in Dakota Territory, settling finally in what would become De Smet, where Charles and Caroline would live for the rest of their lives. 5 states, 5 major relocations, 20 years of moving, and the whole time, the kinship web that had been so carefully built, the web that had Charles and his brother-in-law Henry as co-landowners, neighbours, mutual support, the web was pulling thinner with every mile. Here is what the Little House books do not tell you about Henry Odin Quiner. They give you a warm uncle with a beard, they give you visits and holiday meals, they give you the comfortable fiction of family always nearby. They do not tell you that Henry Quiner, Ma's brother, the man who married first, the man who started the whole chain, took his family into some of the most unforgiving territory on the American frontier. And they do not tell you what it cost. After leaving Pepin County, Henry and Polly's trajectory diverged sharply from Charles and Caroline's. Where Charles looped and wandered Kansas, back to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota Henry moved in a more linear, more final direction, west, then further west, until they reached Harney in Pennington County, South Dakota. Raw country, new country. The kind of place where the nearest doctor might be a day's ride in the best weather, and the worst weather came frequently and stayed long. By the 1870s, children were dying. The Pioneer Girl Project documents it plainly. Of Henry and Polly Quiner's 7 children, 4 died before 1885, 4 out of 7. A child mortality rate of over 57%, devastating even measured against the brutal baseline of frontier child death statistics. We do not have Polly's voice. We have told you that before, and we will not pretend otherwise. No diary, no letters, no personal testimony of any kind from Pauline Malona Ingalls Quiner that has survived the record. What we have instead is the census, and the census is its own kind of testimony. In 1860, Henry and Polly, recently married, in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, 2 souls beginning. In 1870, the family documented in Pepin County, children present. The network is still functioning. In 1880, the census finds them further west, the family smaller than it should be. Children are absent who were present before. The record does not say why. It simply marks absence, the way a ledger marks a debt that has been paid. This is the part of the story that historians call a structural tragedy. Not a personal failure, not a mistake anyone made, but a collision between a kinship strategy and the geography it could not survive. The Ingalls-Quiner network was built on proximity. That was always its operating principle. Neighbouring farms in Jefferson County, adjacent land in Pepin County, 2 chimneys, close enough to see each other's smoke. But proximity requires everyone to stay close, and the frontier economy did not reward staying close. It rewarded moving. It rewarded chasing the next available land before someone else got there. It rewarded following the railroad, the homestead offer, the rumour of better soil 1 county further west. Charles moved west and southwest and north and west again. Henry moved west and kept going. Peter and Eliza Ingalls, the third couple, the last married, the ones who outlived everyone, moved steadily northwest, eventually reaching North Dakota before Eliza would end her days in Eagle Rock, California, dying on the 6th of June 1931, at the age of 89, the longest life of all 6 intermarried spouses. 3 couples who had stood within a mile of each other in Concord Township, Wisconsin, in 1861. 3 couples who had formalized their bonds in Pepin County, adjacent land, shared harvest. And then the continent pulled them apart, one family to the established Dakota frontier of Dismantling, one to the raw and unforgiving Grant County, one eventually to California, until the distance between them was no longer just miles, but everything the miles represent. Different neighbours, different doctors, different churches, different communities to catch you when you fall. The network was not broken by hostility or estrangement. It was broken by America. On the 15th of June, 1886, Henry Odin Quiner died in Harney, Pennington County, South Dakota. He was 50 years old. The man who had started everything, who had walked into the Justice Court in Concord, Wisconsin, on a February morning in 1859 and set in motion a chain of 3 marriages, 2 land purchases, and the entire social architecture beneath the Little House saga, died at 50 on the Dakota frontier, with 4 of his 7 children already in their graves. The cause of death is not documented in the sources available to us. What the Pioneer Girl Project's research makes clear is the setting: Pennington County, South Dakota. One of the most exposed, least established frontier counties in the territory. The kind of place where the distance between a man and a doctor could be the distance between living and dying. He was 50. His father-in-law Lansford Ingalls would live to 84. His wife's brother Charles Ingalls would live to 66. His own wife had 28 months left. Pauline Malona Ingalls Quiner died on the 28th of November, 1888, in Harney City, South Dakota. She was 48 years old, the same Polly who had opened the door between 2 families on a February morning in 1859. The woman who had been 18, not 11, not a child, but 18. An adult woman making a legal marriage to a known neighbour. The woman who had lived in the Pepin County woods when young Laura Ingalls was born. The woman who had watched the kinship web form and hold and slowly, inexorably, stretch thin across the distances of a continent. Henry had been dead for 2 years. 4 of their children were already dead. She was the first of the 6 intermarried spouses to die. Caroline Quiner Ingalls Marr would live until the 20th of April, 1924, dying at 84, on Easter Sunday, in DeSmet, South Dakota. Eliza Quiner Ingalls would outlive them all, dying in California in 1931 at 89. Polly died at 48, in a place most Americans had never heard of, and the silence that fell over her story after her death would hold for over a century. For 39 years after Polly died, there was no Little House series, there were no books. There was just a family, scattered across 5 states, living out the quieter second half of their lives. Peter and Eliza moving west, Caroline aging in DeSmet, Laura building a farmstead in Missouri with her husband Almanzo Wilder. Then, in 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old, living on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, began to write. What she was writing initially was not fiction. It was a memoir. She called it Pioneer Girl. It was the raw, unedited account of her childhood and young womanhood on the frontier Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota territory, told in her own voice. With the particularity and the occasional discomfort of real memory, Pioneer Girl was not published in her lifetime in its original form. What happened instead was that her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, helped shape the manuscript into something more commercially viable, softening edges, adjusting ages, restructuring events into the clean, luminous narrative that would become the Little House series. That process essential to the book's extraordinary success, and understood by literary historians as standard for the era, is also where the historical distortions began. The ages were adjusted. Laura's age in Little House in the Big Woods was changed from approximately 3 or 4 to 5, because publishers felt 3-year-olds' memories were implausible. That single adjustment multiplied across the book, applied inconsistently to the ages of surrounding characters, is the origin point of the age 11 myth about Polly that your viewers have been asking about for years. But the deeper distortion is not about ages. It is about presence. In the Little House books, Aunt Polly and Uncle Henry appear. They are warm. They are fond. They are present at holiday gatherings and family moments. And then they are gone, absorbed back into the background, never followed beyond the warm amber light of the Wisconsin woods. The books do not follow them to Dakota. They do not follow the children who died. They do not stand at the Grant County grave and reckon with what the frontier took from the woman who had started everything. Because Little House in the Big Woods is not a documentary. It is a memoir. It is Laura's memory, filtered through Rose's craft, designed to give readers something true and beautiful and survivable. It is not designed to give readers full accounting. That accounting is what we have been doing. Into the silence that Little House left around Polly's story, a myth grew. You know this myth. It is why you are watching this video. The claim persistent, widespread, emotionally charged that Polly Ingalls was only 11 years old when she married Henry Quiner. The claim that the most famous frontier family in American literature was connected to a child marriage. The claim is false. The primary record is unambiguous. The Pioneer Girl Project, Family Search, the Jefferson County Marriage Register, and the 1,860 federal census all confirm the same thing. Polly Malona Ingalls was born the 14th of October, 1840. She married Henry Quiner on the 15th of February, 1859. She was 18 years old. But myths do not survive because they are true. They survive because they fill a space that the official story left empty. The official story, the Little House story, left Polly's later life empty. It did not explain what happened to her. It did not explain why she is not the centre of the narrative, the way Caroline is. It did not explain the silence around Henry and Polly's family after the Big Woods years. And when people encounter a silence in a story they love, they fill it with what they can find. Internet genealogical discussions. Misread census records. Ages that don't add up because the books never quite clarified them. The myth is a symptom. The silence is a disease. Historians have an obligation that storytellers sometimes resist. They have to follow the story where it actually goes, not just where it is comfortable. The story of the Ingalls-Quiner kinship web goes to Harney City, Pennington County, South Dakota, in the late 1880s. It goes to a grave that most Little House fans have never seen, in a county most could not locate on a map. It goes to a woman of 48 who had buried 4 of her children, whose husband had been dead for 2 years, whose brother had wandered all the way to DeSmet, while she remained in the most exposed corner of the American frontier. Polly Ingalls Quiner does not have a preserved homestead. She does not have a museum. She does not have a television series. She does not have 9 books that have never gone out of print. What she has is the primary record. The birth registration from Cuba Township, New York, the Justice Court Marriage Register from Concord, Wisconsin, the census enumerations that track her family across Wisconsin and into Dakota, the death record from Grant County, the meticulous work of the Pioneer Girl Project, and dedicated genealogical researchers who refuse to let the silence be permanent. And she has this. She has the fact verified, sourced, and documented that on a cold February morning in 1859, when she was 18 years old, She walked into a courthouse and married a 23-year-old neighbor named Henry Quiner. And in doing so, she opened a door that her brother Charles and her future sister-in-law Caroline walked through 11 months later, and that Peter and Eliza walked through 6 months after that. She went first. She opened the door. She paid the highest price. Her name was Polly. She was 18 when she married. And now you know the whole story. If you found yourself wondering as you watched all of this unfold, how a story this well-documented, this specific, this extraordinary, managed to stay hidden for over a century inside one of the most read children's book series in American history, then I want you to think about something. The Little House books are not the only place where a true frontier story got reshaped into something cleaner, something more manageable, something the audience of the time was ready to accept. And the Ingalls family is not the only family whose real history sits just underneath the legend that replaced it. That is a conversation for another night. But if you are the kind of person who likes their history unfiltered, who wants the census record, not just the story they tell about it, then you are in the right place. Subscribe, because we are just getting started. You have been sitting with a question since the last chapter ended, not the myth. We close the myth. Polly was 18, the record is unambiguous, and the story of the child bride has been laid to rest for the final time. The question that should be sitting in your chest right now is different, and it is heavier. If the truth was this clear, how did it disappear? The answer begins not on the frontier, not in South Dakota, where Henry and Polly's graves are still marked in Grant County, far from the Wisconsin township where their story started. It begins in a farmhouse on a rocky hillside in Mansfield, Missouri, in a drawer, with a manuscript written in pencil on school tablets, by a woman 63 years old who was trying to remember everything she could before time took it from her. The year was 1930. Her name was Laura Ingalls Wilder, and what she wrote in that drawer would become the most beloved children's book series in American history and, in the process, would accomplish something she almost certainly never intended. It would make Polly invisible. Here is what most people do not know about the Little House books. They were not the first draft. Before Little House in the Big Woods, before Harper and Brothers, before a single child had ever read a word of Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood, there was a handwritten manuscript, unpublished, unpolished, deeply personal. Laura called it Pioneer Girl. She wrote it in 1930 by hand, in pencil, on school tablets at the Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, where she and her husband Almanzo had lived since 1894. She was 63 years old. She was not writing for children. She was writing for adults, a straight, autobiographical account of what her childhood had actually been, from the earliest years in the Big Woods through to her marriage to Almanzo Wilder in 1885. The Pioneer Girl Project, housed at the South Dakota State Historical Society and published in its annotated form in 2014 under the editorial hand of Pamela Smith Hill, is the scholarly authority on this manuscript. Their work has been the most rigorous fact-checking done on the Ingalls family story in the history of its study. And what the Pioneer Girl manuscript reveals, when you read it alongside the published Little House books, is a gap. Not fraud, not a lie. A gap between the woman who lived a life and the story the market decided that life should become. That gap is where Polly's full story fell. Laura did not write the Little House books alone. This is the part that most people who grew up loving those books find genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. It does not reduce what Laura built. It does not diminish the truth of what she experienced. But it is a documented fact, established through decades of scholarship on the Pioneer Girl typescripts, and the Pioneer Girl Project's annotated edition addresses it with the precision it requires. Rose Wilder Lane was Laura's daughter. She was also, by 1930, one of the most widely published female journalists in America. Her bylines appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. She had reported from Europe. She understood at a cellular, professional level what an American audience in the 1930s wanted from a pioneer story. They wanted warmth. They wanted survival. They wanted a father who made the darkness feel manageable, and a mother who held everything together when the walls shook. They were living through the early months of the Great Depression. Farms were failing. The mythology of frontier self-reliance had never been more commercially necessary or more emotionally urgent. Rose took her mother's pencil-written tablets and she typed them. And in the typing, the story changed. Ages were adjusted. Laura depicts herself as 5 years old at events the primary record places at age 3 or 4. The Pioneer Girl Project documents this specifically, noting that when Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932, Wilder and her editor had deliberately altered her age to make the narrative more commercially appealing to a younger readership. This is the literary mechanism by which an entire family history began to drift subtly, incrementally, with no malice from biographical into mythology. And here is where it connects directly to Polly. Polly Ingalls Quiner appears in the Little House books as Aunt Polly. She is mentioned. She is not invisible. But she is not seen. The books are told entirely through Laura's consciousness, through the eyes of a child whose world was her nuclear family, her parents, her sisters. The extended kinship network that we have spent 4 chapters documenting the 3 interfamily marriages, the joint Pepin County land purchase, the social architecture of the Big Woods community that network is the background of the Little House books, not their foreground. And because Laura never wrote a book about Polly because the Pioneer Girl manuscript, which covered a broader biographical scope, was never published in its unedited form during Laura's lifetime, Polly's story was left to silence. Not deleted, not falsified, eclipsed. There is a difference, and it matters to historical honesty. Laura did not set out to erase her aunt. She set out to tell her own story, and the commercial shape of that story, the nuclear family on the frontier, Pa's fiddle, Ma's calico, Laura and Mary running through the tall grass did not have room for the full weight of what Polly and Henry had lived through in Pennington County, South Dakota. 4 of their 7 children dead before 1885. Henry gone at 50, the 15th of June, 1886, to a landscape that barely kept records of him. Polly gone at 48, the 28th of November, 1888, to a place that history has remembered, mostly as empty. The Little House books were published between 1932 and 1943. By that time, both Henry and Polly had been dead for over 40 years. There was no living voice to fill the silence they had left. There was only the documentary record, the census entries, the death registrations, the Pennington County land files, and a literary series that had become so dominant in American cultural memory that it functioned for millions of readers as the official biography of the Ingalls and Quiner families. What the books did not say, people assumed had not happened. And so, the woman who married first, the woman whose marriage opened the door between 2 families and made Pa and Ma's famous union possible, she became a footnote. The Little House books did not create the age 11 myth directly. That requires a second step. Here is how the mechanism worked, and it is a mechanism that should feel uncomfortably familiar in 2026. Laura depicts her own age as 5 in events that primary records place at age 3 or 4. This is documented. The books are narrated with the authority of personal memory, first person, specific sensory detail, the confident voice of someone who was there. The reader has no reason to suspect that the ages are literary adjustments rather than biographical fact. Now introduce a reader who knows, from somewhere in the Little House cultural ecosystem, a fan site, a family history blog, a comment thread that Aunt Polly married young. They carry into reading the framework of a series that has trained them to accept stated ages as accurate. They perform a rough mental calculation. They arrive at a number that is wrong. They share it. The internet multiplied this process on a scale that Laura and Rose could never have anticipated in the 1930s. By the time genealogical discussion groups, YouTube comment sections, and social media family history accounts had run the claim through enough iterations, the number 11 was attached to Polly's name in the popular record with the tenacity of a primary source. The Pioneer Girl Project's blog entries, particularly the research on the Henry O. Quiner family, represent the scholarly corrective. They establish, clearly and traceably, that Polly was born the 14th of October 1840 and married the 15th of February 1859. She was 18. Math is not ambiguous. The myth has no documentary support in any primary record. But here is the harder truth, the one this series has been building towards since Chapter 1. A myth that fulfills an emotional need is more durable than a correction that merely states a fact. The age 11 claim persisted not because people were careless. It persisted because it was shocking. It travelled because it was shareable. It survived fact-checking for decades because the books that contradicted it, the Little House books, were so beloved, so embedded in American female cultural memory, that the distorted framework they created felt more real than the documentary record that corrected it. This is the same mechanism that operates every time a beloved story colonizes the history it is based on. And the only antidote to it, the only thing that has ever worked, is exactly what this series has been doing. Going back to the documents. Every time. Caroline Quiner Ingalls Marr lived to 84 years old. She died on the 20th of April, 1924, in DeSmet, South Dakota, surrounded by her surviving daughters. By the time she died, Laura was already planning the books that would make Caroline Quiner Ingalls one of the most recognized women in American literary history. Her face, or rather the face the books built for her, is embedded in the childhood reading memory of generations of American women. Polly Ingalls Quiner, the woman who married first, the woman whose wedding made Marr's wedding possible, died on the 28th of November, 1888. She was 48 years old. She died in Harney, Pennington County, South Dakota, one of the most remote and least documented corners of the frontier. Henry had been gone for 2 years already. 4 of their 7 children were already in their graves. The remaining 3 were scattered. There is almost no direct personal testimony from Polly in the accessible historical record. No diary, no letters that have survived in any public archive, no account written in her own hand of what it felt like to lose 4 children, or to watch the kinship network built by 3 weddings in 28 months slowly pull apart under the weight of a continent. The Pioneer Girl Project's research on the Henry O. Quiner family documents her vital statistics, her birth, her marriage, her children's names, her death, but cannot reconstruct her voice. She was literate. Her family valued education deeply. Caroline had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, and both families carried the New England Protestant tradition that treated literacy as essential. But if Polly wrote, her words did not survive the Dakota frontier in the form of any document this research has been able to locate. What we can say, because the documentary record supports it, is this. The woman who was Marr's sister-in-law, Pa's sister, and the architect of the kinship web that made the Little House world possible, she outlived the kinship web, buried more children than she should have had to bury, buried her husband on soil that would not hold a marker for long, and died 2 years later, without ceremony, without a niece old enough or close enough to write it down. Laura was 21 when Polly died. She was living in DeSmet, Dakota Territory, newly married to Almanzo Wilder, focused on the relentless daily demands of frontier life. She did not write Polly's story. She may not have known it fully. She may not have had access to it. The distance between DeSmet and Pennington County, South Dakota, in 1888, was not just geographic. It was the distance between the kinship network that had survived and the branch that had not. And 40 years later, when Laura sat down with her school tablets and her pencil to write Pioneer Girl, the woman she remembered as Aunt Polly was already 2 generations removed from the documentary record's ability to recover her. This is how a real woman becomes a footnote, not through malice. Through time, distance, silence, and the gravitational pull of a more famous story. Here is what we know as this chapter ends. The myth has been dismantled 4 chapters ago, and confirmed again here through the scholarly apparatus of the Pioneer Girl Project. The mechanism of erasure has been traced from Rose Wilder Lane's editorial hand, through the literary framework of the Little House books, through the internet's amplification of the distorted framework, to the present moment. And the woman herself, Pauline Malona Ingalls Quiner, born the 14th of October 1840, married the 15th of February 1859, died the 28th of November 1888, has been restored, chapter by chapter, to the historical record she was always part of but rarely centred in. But there is one question this series has not yet answered, and it is the question that will define the final chapter. What do we do with a historical record that preserves the framework but loses the voice? Because here is the thing about the documentary silence around Polly. It is not just her voice that is missing. It is the voice of every woman on the frontier whose story was absorbed into a more famous story, whose life was real and fully lived, whose choices mattered and whose losses were devastating, and who left no manuscript, no journal, no letter in a drawer that a daughter could type and send to publishers. The Little House books exist because Laura left a manuscript. Rose typed it, the market bought it, a myth was built. Polly left nothing that has survived in the accessible record. And that asymmetry, that profound, structural asymmetry, is not a personal failing. It is the shape of history for women whose stories were not commodifiable, not famous enough, not attached to a family name that already had cultural currency. Chapter 6 does not flinch from that. It asks the question that the entire series has been building toward. When the document stops, when the archive goes silent, what is the historian's obligation to the person who lived there? And it answers it. But first, you need to understand one more thing about the gap between what Polly lived and what the record preserved. Because what is missing from the record is not random. It follows a pattern. And that pattern tells us something about American frontier history that the Little House books, for all their genuine beauty, were not designed to say. There is a specific kind of silence that historians learn to read. Not the silence of something that never happened, not the silence of a secret being kept, but the silence of something that happened fully, completely, in every ordinary and extraordinary dimension, and simply was not recorded, because the people doing the recording were not looking at it. Polly Ingalls Quiner's life is that kind of silence. We know she was born. We know she is married. We know her children's names. We know 4 of them died before she did. We know where she is buried. What we do not know, what the documentary record will not give us, no matter how carefully we look, is what she thought about any of it. Her voice is gone, but the shape of its absence is not random. And understanding why it is missing, understanding the specific structural reasons that a woman like Polly leaves a documentary shadow instead of a documentary trail, is the final lesson this series has to offer. Because it is not just about Polly. It is about what the Little House books taught 3 generations of American women to understand as the shape of frontier history and what that shape left out. Let us be precise about this. The Pioneer Girl Project, the most rigorous scholarly examination of the Ingalls and Quiner families in existence, explicitly acknowledges the gap. Their entry on the Henry O. Quiner family documents her vital statistics but cannot recover her inner experience. Their researchers are working from the same archive this series has worked on. The silence is real, and it has 4 specific causes. First, geographic marginalization. Polly and Henry's final years were spent in Harney, Pennington County, South Dakota, one of the most remote corners of the Dakota frontier. Grant County in the 1880s had sparse institutional infrastructure. Records were kept inconsistently. Newspapers were thin. The bureaucratic apparatus that would have preserved a woman's correspondence or personal testimony simply was not robust in the place where Polly spent her last years. Second, narrative eclipse. Laura Ingalls Wilder's literary fame drew all documentary attention toward the Charles Caroline line of the family. Collateral lines, Polly and Henry's, were not the subject of dedicated preservation efforts. When family historians and literary scholars began archiving the Ingalls world in the 20th century, they followed the famous name. Polly's descendants did not have a famous name to anchor the preservation. Third, death before documentation. Both Polly and Henry died in 1886 and 1888, respectively, before the wave of oral history collection and frontier memoir writing that preserved many frontier voices in the early 20th century. The window for recovery was already closing by the time anyone thought to look. Fourth, the Feme Covert legal framework. Under the legal doctrine of Feme Covert that governed married women's rights throughout most of the 19th century in Wisconsin and South Dakota, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed into her husband's. This is not just a legal abstraction. It meant that Polly's letters, if she wrote them, were not preserved in correspondence archives. Her land transactions, if she initiated them, were recorded under Henry's name. Her economic and legal existence left fewer formal traces than Henry's, and Henry's, as a non-famous collateral figure, left few enough. These 4 forces converged on Polly's story and produced the silence we are working inside of right now. That silence is not the exception in women's frontier history. It is the rule. The Little House books are extraordinary documents. This series has never argued otherwise. They capture something true and deeply felt about the experience of frontier life, the cold, the labour, the music played against the dark, the specific texture of love that forms in conditions of shared hardship. Millions of women reading those books as girls recognized something in them that was real, not because the biography was perfectly accurate, but because the emotional architecture was honest. But here is what those books, by the specific structure of their narrative, were not designed to say. The frontier was also a place where women's stories disappeared. Not just Polly's, not just the collateral figures in a famous family's orbit, but thousands of women whose lives were fully lived, whose choices shaped the communities around them, and who left no manuscript in a drawer for a daughter to type. Caroline Quiner Ingalls left a legacy because Laura wrote it down. Laura left a legacy because Rose shaped it for the market. The books exist because the commercial machinery of American publishing in the 1930s had a use for this specific story. Polly left no legacy in the same form because none of those conditions were met. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one, and recognizing it as structural rather than personal is what separates honest history from comfortable mythology. The Little House books, for all their genuine beauty, present a version of the frontier in which the right family, the warm, musical, self-reliant, fundamentally coherent family survives and is remembered. But the historical record shows us a different truth. The Wright family, in 1888, Pennington County, South Dakota, could still lose 4 of 7 children before the mother was 48 years old. The Wright family could still dissolve into the land without a marker that held long enough to be found. The Wright family could still be reduced, in the documentary record, to a handful of vital statistics and a silence where a voice should be. Polly was the Wright family. She was the first of them to marry. She did everything the frontier asked of her. The frontier asked too much. This section must be honest about what recovery is possible and what it is not. The Pioneer Girl Project has done the most thorough work available on the Quiner and Ingalls family lines. Their research has established Polly's birth date, confirmed her marriage record, traced her children's names and death dates as fully as the documentary record allows, and identified the gap explicitly rather than papering over it. Family Search genealogical databases, the Henry Quiner Family Research Group, and the meticulous work of genealogical researchers on platforms that allow public contribution to have extended this record incrementally. What they have given back to Polly, working collectively across decades, is this. A woman born the 14th of October 1840 in Cuba Township, New York. A 5th child in a large family. A teenager who grew up next door, quite literally, to a family whose land adjoined her father's 80 acres in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. A young woman of 18 who walked to a justice court in February 1859 and stood beside a 23-year-old man named Henry Odin Quiner from Cincinnati, Ohio. A woman who moved west with her husband, who bore 7 children, who buried 4 of them before she was 45, who watched the kinship network built by 3 weddings in 28 months pull gradually apart under the pressure of a continent and the force of Charles Ingalls' relentless westward motion, until the Wisconsin neighborhood where it had all begun was a memory that none of the 3 couples could easily return to. A woman who died in Pennington County, South Dakota, on the 28th of November, 1888, at 48 years old, 2 years after her husband. That is what the record gives back. It does not give back her voice, her opinion, her experience of grief, her understanding of her own life. Historical recovery has limits. Honesty requires naming them. What this documentary can offer, and what it does offer, deliberately as its final act, is the insistence that those limits do not excuse the forgetting. The silence around Polly is not neutral. It is the product of specific historical forces, legal, geographic, narrative, structural, that this series has now named one by one. Naming them is the first act of restoration. You might be wondering, at this point in the series, why a genealogical error about a woman who has been dead for over 130 years still requires a 4-chapter documentary to correct. The answer is not about Polly specifically. The answer is about the mechanism. The age 11 myth about Polly Ingalls was built through a specific, traceable process. A beloved literary series created a framework that readers accepted as biographical fact. Age adjustments made in the service of commercial storytelling were absorbed into the popular record without correction, and the internet's amplification engine turned a localized misreading into a widely distributed claim. That mechanism is not unique to the Little House world. It is not unique to the 19th century. It is operating right now, today, in every corner of popular history, in every docuseries that compresses timelines for dramatic effect, in every viral claim that sounds like history because it comes attached to a beloved story, in every comment thread where a misremembering gets corrected by another misremembering and neither person checks a primary source. The Pioneer Girl project represents one model of what the correction looks like. Rigorous, annotated, sourced to primary documents, willing to say we don't know when the record is genuinely silent. This series is that model applied to a 45-minute documentary format. And the reason it matters is simple. Stories we tell about the past shape the questions we ask about the present. If the story we tell about frontier women is the Little House story, the warm, coherent, sunlit version, where the right family survives and is remembered, and the books get written, then we are not equipped to ask the harder question about the women whose stories did not make it to print. If we accept the age 11 myth as fact, we have accepted a version of frontier history in which an adult woman's choice is replaced by a child's powerlessness, and we have made that substitution without realizing it. Polly was 18. She was an adult. She made a choice. She married a man she had known for years, in a community she understood, at an age that placed her within the normal range of frontier marriage. Restoring that fact is not a small act of genealogical tidiness. It is the restoration of her agency. And that restoration matters not because Polly is here to receive it, but because the mechanism that erased it is still running. The 15th of February, 1859. The 1st of February, 1860. The 5th of June, 1861. 3 weddings. 28 months. 2 families from neighboring farms in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, binding themselves to each other with a density that anthropologists would recognize as a deliberate kinship strategy, shaped by geographic proximity, shared economic precarity, and the specific social ecology of the frontier. The first wedding opened the door. The second became the most famous marriage in American frontier mythology. The third closed the circle. And of the 6 people who stood at those 3 Wisconsin altars, Henry and Polly, Charles and Caroline, Peter and Eliza, the one who married first is the one history remembered least. She was not the most famous. She was not the most mobile. She did not have a daughter who became a writer. She had the hardest version of life all 3 couples faced. She paid the price the frontier demanded in full, in children, in years, in miles, from the place where her story began. Her name was Pauline Malona Ingalls Quiner. She was born the 14th of October, 1840, in Cuba Township, New York. She married the 15th of February, 1859, in Justice Court, Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. She was 18 years old. She died the 28th of November, 1888, in Harney, Pennington County, South Dakota. She was 48 years old. Between those 2 dates, she built a family, buried half of it, watched the kinship network she had helped create scatter across 3 states, and died in a place that history barely kept records of. She did not leave a manuscript. She did not have a daughter who typed one. But she was here. The record confirms it. The documents hold it. And now through this series, through the Pioneer Girl Project's meticulous scholarship, through the genealogical research that has been slowly, carefully, piece by piece restoring what the dominant narrative left out, so do you. History does not owe the living a comfortable story. It owes the dead an honest one. Caroline Quiner Ingalls Marr received her honest story in the form of 9 books, a television series, and a permanent place in American cultural memory. She earned it through the specificity of her love, the quality of her endurance, and the accident of having a daughter who became a writer. Polly Ingalls Quiner received the silence on the other side of the split screen. The De Smet homestead, preserved, photographed, visited by thousands of people every year who walk through the rooms Marr kept, and read the placards that tell her story. And the empty Pennington County landscape, where Polly and Henry are buried in ground that the frontier barely marked, in a place that no tourist infrastructure has gathered around, in a story that required 4 chapters of a documentary to reconstruct from the fragments the archive was willing to give back. This is not an indictment by Laura Ingalls Wilder. It is not an indictment of Caroline Quiner Ingalls' memory. It is an acknowledgement of the structural reality that produced the asymmetry, the specific forces of narrative, market, geography, and law that decided which woman's voice would be preserved and which woman's silence would stand. The restoration this series has offered is partial. Every honest historian will tell you that the restoration of a voice the record did not keep is, by definition, incomplete. We have given Polly her age, her birth date, her marriage date, the number of her children, the date of her death. We have given her the context, the kinship strategy, the frontier conditions, the social ecology of the community she helped build. We have not given her back her words, because the record did not save them. But we have done what can be done. We have made the silence visible. We have named the forces that produced it. And we have placed her, one final time, where she has always belonged at the centre of the story, on the morning of the 15th of February, 1859, standing in a Wisconsin justice court, 18 years old, about to do something that would change the trajectory of 2 families and eventually make one of the most beloved American literary dynasties possible. She went first. She deserved better than a myth that made her 11. She deserved better than a footnote in her niece's books. She deserved to be remembered as exactly what the primary record confirms she was. An adult woman, making her own choice, on a winter morning in Wisconsin. Her name was Polly. She married first. And now, finally, completely, with the full weight of the documentary record behind it, you know her story.